With Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas, a Tea Party favorite, and also somebody who is said to be contemplating a presidential run in 2016, although I'm sure it's the farthest thing from your mind.
You know, tonight what's on my mind is the State of the Union.
Well, let's talk about it. What is your response to what President Obama had to say? There was talk of executive order, doing things on his own, but also some things he wanted to do with Congress, if Congress could do it. What was your response?
Well, there were really two things. There was one, the continued pattern we've seen over and over again in this presidency of just going it alone, of asserting executive power. That has really been a disturbing pattern in this administration. But secondly, there was a lack of acknowledgement of the problems people are facing. So, for example, the president, nowhere did he acknowledge that as a result of the Obama economic policies, today we have the lowest labor force participation this country has ever seen since 1978. That what we're doing isn't working, and what he proposed is more of the same policies that have caused, under the Obama administration, the rich to get richer, and yet people who are struggling, young people, Hispanics, African Americans, single moms, by the millions to lose their jobs, to lose their health insurance, to struggle, and he didn't acknowledge any of that.
Well, he did talk about economic struggle, but let's unpack your 2 points. The first one having to do with the president taking executive action. He talked specifically about the action he took today to raise the minimum wage for federal contract workers in the future. Not a huge step. In fact, Speaker Boehner said it probably affects, in the immediate term, no one. But the argument from the White House is, look, the president wants to work with Congress, but there is a group of Republicans, Tea Party Republicans, such as yourself, such as many in the House, who block any sort of attempts at compromise, and therefore he has to do something. What's your response to that argument?
I mean, that's their talking point. You're right. But he doesn't try to work with Congress. He doesn't talk with Congress. You know, I remember when we were having the battle last fall about defunding Obamacare, I remember one surreal meeting where he invited every Republican over to the White House. All the Republican senators sat us in a room and said, I invited you here to tell you I will not compromise, I will not negotiate on anything. I've never been in a meeting where someone brings you in to say, we're not even going to talk about it. You know, if you look at, let's take a couple of examples of bipartisan pro-growth policies.
Well, when you say he said he wouldn't compromise, you mean he wouldn't compromise on he wasn't going to defund Obamacare?
Well, and you know, it's interesting, in highlight, I bet you there are a lot of Democrats that wish he hadn't taken that hard line, because as we've seen the disaster that is Obamacare, you've got now a dozen Democrats who publicly come out for delaying many aspects of Obamacare,
Sure,
which we could have agreed to do then, but he dug in and said he wasn't interested in talking or compromising. You know, there are many pro-growth, pro-economic, pro-job policies that have bipartisan support. For example, building the Keystone Pipeline. Overwhelming bipartisan support. Over 60 senators voted for it last year, including a number of Democrats.
Right.
President Obama is single-handedly blocking building the Keystone Pipeline, which would immediately create tens of thousands of high-paying jobs, and Harry Reid won't even allow it to come up for a vote. You know,
but the Keystone Pipeline, obviously, whatever the merits of the project, that's not an economic plan.
Of course. But it would produce tens of thousands of new jobs.
Right.
Another example where you have bipartisan, you know, talk about areas of compromise. Bipartisan agreement, repealing the medical devices tax. We had a vote on that, had over 70 senators, huge bipartisan vote. But once again, Harry Reid, at President Obama's urging, won't allow it to come up for a vote. The medical device tax is punitive. It kills jobs. It kills innovation. What we ought to be doing if we want to see jobs is not raising regulations, adding regulations. We ought to be championing fundamental tax reform, fundamental regulatory reform, reducing the burden on small businesses. That's how you get jobs.
You have scathing, if you'll permit me to use the word, scathing op-ed in the Wall Street Journal coming out tomorrow. The Imperial Presidency of Barack Obama is the title, the subtitle. In the nation's history, there is simply no precedent for an American president so wantonly ignoring federal law. Now, if you look at the record of executive orders, this president has issued fewer executive orders than George W. Bush at this point in his presidency, Bill Clinton at this point in his presidency. How can you say an imperial presidency wantonly ignoring federal law?
Because, Jake, the measure is not how many executive orders, it's what substantively he has done. Over and over again, if he disagrees with a law, he simply says he won't enforce it. He's done that in immigration law, on drug laws, on welfare law, and most strikingly on Obamacare. The text of Obamacare says the employer mandate kicks in on January 1st, 2014. Contrary to law, President Obama just granted a one-year extension to big business. He has no authority in the statute to do so, but he told big business, ignore that part of the law for a year. The text of the law says members of Congress should be on the exchanges with no subsidies, just like millions of Americans. Because Harry Reid and the Senate Democrats didn't want to be on the exchanges, the president unilaterally granted them an exemption the law doesn't allow. And let me tell you the most striking one of all. When over 5 million Americans lost their health insurance because Obamacare made their health insurance illegal, every other president facing something like that would have gone to Congress, would have tried to negotiate a way to fix a law that was hurting people. What he did instead is he held a press conference and he told insurance companies, issue laws that the statute Obamacare makes illegal. There is no precedent in the history of our country for a president instructing private companies, violate the law, I'm telling you to ignore the law. And I got to say, that's dangerous when the president picks and chooses what laws to follow.
I know President Obama disagrees with how you're assessing many of those things. I will be interviewing him on Thursday. We'll run the interview Friday, so we'll get some response. Wolf, we're going to have more with Senator Ted Cruz later on CNN, but for now I'm going to throw it back to you. And joining me now is Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, a stalwart Tea Partier and an opponent of President Obama. What did you hear tonight that you liked? Anything?
Well, there were a couple of things. One, he made mention to streamlining regulations. Now, that has not been the pattern of the last 5 years of this administration. The pattern of this administration has been more and more job-killing regulations. But if he meant that he's open to streamlining regulations to help small businesses create jobs, that's something I could get excited about. He also mentioned something he called My IRA. Now, I'm not sure what that is, but he suggested it was a savings account that would enable people to save. I am a huge proponent of enabling and empowering people to save assets they control, they own, that are theirs. And so I don't know the details of the proposal, but I'll tell you,
you like those
ran into Gene Sperling on the floor of the Senate afterwards, and I said, I'm not sure of the details, but I'd like to see them, because depending on what it is, it could be something we could work together on.
Now that we've accentuated the positive, let's discuss some of the negative. You have this new op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, the imperial presidency of Barack Obama. You accuse him of wantonly ignoring federal law. That's not quite accusing him of being a criminal, but it comes a little bit close.
It's actually a different thing. It is, we have never seen a president in the history of our country who, when he disagrees with a law, simply says he will not enforce it and unilaterally decrees changes to it. When he didn't agree with immigration laws or drug laws or welfare laws, he said his administration will not enforce them anymore. And with Obamacare, over and over again, he has directly contradicted the law, just changed it unilaterally. He granted an exemption for big business, even though the text of the law says big business doesn't get an exemption. He granted an exemption for members of Congress, even though the text of the law says they don't get an exemption. And most strikingly, when you had over 5 million people lose their health insurance, despite the president's promise, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan, he simply held a press conference in which he instructed private health insurance companies, issue plans that are illegal under the text of Obamacare. There is no precedent for any president of the United States instructing private citizens, go violate the law, and for 1 year, I won't prosecute you. And the point I make in the op-ed is this should not be a partisan issue, even if you happen to agree with him on policy matters. The precedent of the president picking and choosing what laws to follow is a dangerous precedent. And, you know, to be honest, I think a lot of folks in the media have given him a pass on this. There's going to come another president, a Republican president, and if you have this power for the president to say, I don't agree with this tax law, this environmental law, this labor law, so I'm just going to change it, that threatens the liberty of every American. It ought to concern all of us, Republicans, Democrats, independents, or libertarians. That much power in the president's dangerous.
Isn't it true that these 5 million plans that have been canceled, if that figure is correct, and I've heard that it's disputed, but those whose plans are no longer valid under Obamacare, isn't it true a lot of those Americans are going to have plans that are just different than the plans that were canceled at the end of December 31st? They'll have new plans. So it's not 5 million or whatever the number is. Without insurance, it's 5 million that now have different insurance.
Well, number one, the promise the president made was if you like your health care plan, you can keep your health care plan, period. Those 5 million people liked their health care plan, and they discovered they were canceled, and that wasn't a side effect. It was because the text of the law made their plans illegal because the Obama administration, in writing the law, determined they didn't like those plans that these individuals wanted. And so the promise they were made was deliberately, repeatedly false. But number two, yes, some of them have been able to get new plans. Many of them are paying higher premiums, have higher deductibles, and have less covered. And they're also discovering, as are millions of Americans, that the promise, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, isn't true as well.
If you think that he is wantonly ignoring federal law, if you think he is imperial, if you think that what he is doing or what he is about to do with these executive orders is outside the Constitution, what are you going to do about it?
Well, I can tell you, the courts have tried to hold him accountable. Since January of 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court has unanimously rejected the Obama administration's assertion of federal power 9 separate times. But he is disregarding the law on an unprecedented way. And we need to have accountability because rule of law matters. The same thing's true on Benghazi. On Benghazi, he said he wanted to get to the bottom of it. And yet, if he really means that, he ought to support a joint select committee in Congress to find out what happened.
I will say that there has been an independent State Department investigation, and the Senate Intelligence Committee did look into it. But we will talk again, and we will continue to have this conversation. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.